This is Lando Favela with the book of Leviticus, the third book of the Bible. As usual, we'll read the entire book without skipping anything, and we'll give some brief comments for understanding. We read from the World English Bible because it's a very strict and accurate translation, and it's not copyrighted. Therefore, we can read the entire text without legal issues. Leviticus picks up where Exodus left off. In Exodus, Israel escaped their slavery in Egypt, passed through the Red Sea, then trekked through the desert to their current location, which is that they're now camped at the base of Mount Horeb, also called Mount Sinai, in the desert. Moses has been meeting with Yahweh on the mountain and in the camp, and writing down what Yahweh's been saying. Through Moses, Yahweh instructed Israel to build a tent for himself so that he, Yahweh, could literally live with them, and Israel built it. It's called the tabernacle, which is another word for tent. Leviticus is almost all Yahweh giving Moses dictation, so to speak. Moses is acting as a copyist or transcriptionist, hearing the voice of Yahweh and writing down what he says. Yahweh's been giving him law for Israel because now that they're an independent nation, they need something to govern them. If Yahweh's words were in red in Leviticus, the book would be almost all red because it's almost all Yahweh speaking to Moses. A lot of it reads like a technical handbook for the priests on how to conduct their responsibilities. But behind all the technicalities, there are messages applicable to the Christian in every chapter, messages that we don't get anywhere else and that we can't appreciate unless we wade into the details. There's no need to memorize the priestly procedures since none of us is a priest under the law of Moses, but we should try to understand the procedures at least for a moment so that the idea behind them comes through. We'll forget most of the details eventually, but the general ideas will stick with us. Getting into some of the details, in chapters 1 to 7, Yahweh will instruct Moses how to conduct the various types of sacrifices, namely burnt, grain, peace, sin, and guilt offerings. These will take place in the courtyard of the tabernacle. When the offering involves an animal, the priest will burn some or all the body parts on the bronze altar. The altar was most holy, Exodus 29:37. It was 7.5 feet square and 4.5 feet high, Exodus 27. It was something like a giant barbecue grill. There was wood underneath for the fire and a bronze grate above for holding the animal parts. Verse 1. Yahweh called to Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, and tell them, when any one of you offers an offering to Yahweh, you shall offer your offering of the livestock from the herd and from the flock." Comment in verse 1, Yahweh speaking to Moses in the tent of meeting. This will be the case throughout the book of Leviticus. Moses is talking face to face with Yahweh, taking dictation from him, so to speak. When Yahweh described the tent in Exodus, how it should be built, he told Moses he would speak to him from above the mercy seat of the ark. From there he would tell him all that he commanded for the children of Israel, Exodus 25:22. So that's what Yahweh's doing here. He's making commandments for the children of Israel. In verse 2, Yahweh starts his instructions on offerings, and he'll keep going on the subject of offerings for 7 chapters. Offerings will come from the herd and flock, he says. It turns out that the herd means cattle, and the flock means sheep and goats. There'll also be offerings of doves and pigeons, but that's it, just those 5 kinds of animals. There'll only be 5 sacrificial species in Israel. In times before, in Genesis and Exodus, sacrifices were a little more freestyle, such as when Abraham built homemade altars and sacrificed on them. But there's to be no more freestyling in Israel. Starting now, Yahweh will only approve of the sacrifices at the tabernacle by the priests on the bronze altar, although he'll make a few exceptions in the future, 1 Samuel 16:5 and other places. Coming up, instructions for a burnt offering from the herd, which means of cattle. A burnt offering is one of the 5 main types of sacrifice. All the sacrifices will involve some burning because burning is the way of sending it up to Yahweh. But for the type specifically known as the burnt offering, the entire animal will go up except the skin. The priest will perform this on behalf of the person who brings the animal. Speaking of the person bringing it, verse 3, if his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he shall offer a male without defect. He shall offer it at the door of the tent of meeting, that he may be accepted before Yahweh. He shall lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it shall be accepted for him to make atonement for him. He shall kill the bull before Yahweh. Aaron's sons, the priests, shall present the blood and sprinkle the blood around on the altar that is at the door of the tent of meeting. He shall flay the burnt offering and cut it into pieces. The sons of Aaron the priest shall put fire on the altar and lay wood in order on the fire, and Aaron's sons the priests shall lay the pieces, the head, and the fat in order on the wood that is on the fire, which is on the altar. But its innards and its legs he shall wash with water. The priest shall burn all of it on the altar for a burnt offering, an offering made by fire of a pleasant aroma to Yahweh. Comment in verse 3, cattle for burnt offerings shall be bulls without defect. A grown bull would be hard to control, so often it was a calf. It should at least be 8 days old, Leviticus 22:27. The person who offers it will bring it into the court in view of the door of the tent, which means on the east side of the tent. In verse 4, whoever brings it will lay his hand on the animal's head. This symbolizes that the person's transferring his sin to the animal. Thus, when the animal's offered, quote, it shall be accepted to make atonement for him, as verse 4 says, meaning Yahweh will accept the sacrifice and wipe that person's slate clean. The animal has taken on that person's sin. Clearly, this foreshadowed Christ's sacrifice of himself. Christ bore our sins, 1 Peter 2:24. If we lay hold of Christ, Christ accepts that we're transferring our sin to him, and God no longer holds us guilty. It's a matter of us coming to God as individuals, as the individual came to the door of the tent with his animal, and asking for Christ's sacrifice to be applied to us, for us. In verse 5, they shall kill the animal, and the priest will sprinkle the blood around on the altar. Christ is our priest. He applied his blood to the cross and around the base of it, so it's another foreshadowing. In verse 6, the animal should be flayed, which means skinned, cut in pieces, and in verse 8, a priest will place the pieces on the altar. In verse 9, the legs and innards should be washed in water before going on to the altar. So everything went on the altar but the blood and skin. In verse 9, it'll be a pleasant aroma to Yahweh, not that Yahweh took pleasure in the death of the animal, but that a man has approached him in faith and has been restored in relationship to him. That was the pleasing aroma. Obviously, as Christians today, we don't physically take Christ to a cross and sacrifice him. Rather, we accept by faith that his sacrifice was for us. It's for us the way it was for Abraham, quote, Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness, Genesis 15:6 and Romans 4:3. We believe that Christ's sacrifice was for us, and it's accounted to us as righteousness. Now, coming in the rest of the chapter, burnt offerings for sheep, goats, turtle doves, and pigeons. The procedures for these will be very similar to the burnt offering of cattle. Verse 10, if his offering is from the flock, from the sheep or from the goats, for a burnt offering, he shall offer a male without defect. He shall kill it on the north side of the altar before Yahweh. Aaron's sons, the priest, shall sprinkle its blood around on the altar. He shall cut it into its pieces with its head and its fat. The priest shall lay them in order on the wood that is on the fire, which is on the altar, but the innards and the legs he shall wash with water. The priest shall offer the whole and burn it on the altar. It's a burnt offering, an offering made by fire, of a pleasant aroma to Yahweh. Comment in verse 10, just as for cattle, burnt offerings of sheep and goats shall be males without defect. This foreshadows that Christ was a male and without sin, Hebrews 4:15. In verse 12, the priest shall lay the parts of the animal in order on the wood. There was some order to it. Christ's parts, his hands and feet, were placed in a particular way on the cross. In verse 13, the priest shall offer the whole of the animal. Christ offered the whole of himself. Also in verse 13, the offering was a pleasant aroma to Yahweh, which is another foreshadowing. Christ, quote, gave himself up for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God as a fragrant aroma, Ephesians 5:2. The animal going up in aroma also symbolizes Christ's resurrection and return to the Father. When Christ rose from the grave and went up, quote, he came even to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him, Daniel 7:13. Now the burnt offering of doves and pigeons, verse 14. If his offering to Yahweh is a burnt offering of birds, then he shall offer his offering of turtle doves or of young pigeons. The priest shall bring it to the altar and wring off its head and burn it on the altar, and its blood shall be drained out of the side of the altar. And he shall take away its crop with its filth, and cast it beside the altar on the east part, in the place of the ashes. He shall tear it by its wings, but shall not divide it apart. The priest shall burn it on the altar, on the wood that is on the fire. It is a burnt offering, an offering made by fire, of a pleasant aroma to Yahweh. Comment in verse 17, why did Yahweh say tear it by its wings? Let's call it another foreshadowing. A bird's wings are its glory and give him his extraordinary ability to fly. This reminds us of Christ's extraordinary arrival here, that when he came, he put away his glory and his extraordinary abilities. He took ordinary form and did all his mighty works by the power of the Holy Spirit, Matthew 12:28, not by his own power. He, quote, emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being made in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself, Philippians 2:6-8. Sacrifices are ugly, which matches the ugliness of our sin and the ugliness of the crucifixion in one way of looking at it, but in another way it was a beautiful thing for Christ to do, and it produced a beautiful result. That concludes the chapter and the burnt offerings. Go to landofhavilah.net for all the convenient ways you can access this material. Leviticus 2 is next.